Have you ever felt like you're just playing a role where you have all the right props, but like none of the actual skills?
Oh, I think everyone has felt that at some point,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like imagine wearing this pristine pilot's uniform, sitting in the cockpit, you're holding the manual, but you have absolutely no idea how to fly the plane.
That is a terrifying thought, honestly.
It really is, but that tension between just possessing the outward symbols of qualification and actually having the internal reality is something that really haunts human nature. And, well, it is the exact tension we are plunging into today.
And it's a dynamic that shows up everywhere, right? I mean, from corporate compliance forms to our own personal belief systems, we gravitate toward the external markers of success or righteousness because, well, they're visible. We can measure them,
Exactly. You can check a box.
right? You can check a box. But the internal reality, the actual state of the heart, is messy, it's hidden, and it's much, much harder to prove.
Which brings us perfectly to the mission for our deep dive today. We are exploring a really fascinating academic paper that completely deconstructs the theological and rhetorical architecture of the Epistle to the Romans, specifically focusing on Romans chapter 2.
Yeah, it's a heavy hitter of a text.
It is. The author argues that the Apostle Paul uses a very specific symmetrical logic to connect inward, heart-level obedience with divine judgment.
Right.
And we're going to see how this logic defends the ongoing validity of moral law, how misunderstanding it led to, well, a devastating historical error known as replacement theology.
Which is a huge topic on its own.
Massive.
Yeah.
And we'll also look at what a giant ancient olive tree has to do with covenant stability and ultimately how this ancient text directly applies to your daily life today.
I love that. It's not just ancient history. It matters right now.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. To understand the sheer force of this argument, we really have to put ourselves in a deeply divided first century room.
Yeah, context is everything here. You have to picture the original audience in Rome. You have Jewish believers who, carry centuries of covenantal history.
All right, they have the pedigree.
Exactly. They have the Torah, the law of Moses, the dietary laws, the physical marker of circumcision. And then on the exact opposite side of the room, you have Gentile believers coming from a pagan background with absolutely none of that heritage.
Just a completely blank slate historically.
Yeah. So the social and spiritual hierarchy in that room was palpable. To address this, Paul sets up what the paper calls a symmetrical judgment grid.
A symmetrical judgment grid.
Right. It's a rhetorical framework designed to entirely level the playing field between these two groups.
So he builds this grid by looking at two specific groups and two potential outcomes, right? On one side, you have the Gentiles, those who do not have the written law of Moses.
Yes.
And on the other side, you have the Jews, those who are under the law.
And the brilliance of it is in how he applies the exact same two outcomes to both demographics.
Symmetrical.
Exactly. Symmetrical. Outcome one is sinning. If a Gentile sins without the law, they perish without the law. If a Jew sins under the law, they are judged by the written law.
So sin just leads to judgment regardless of your pedigree.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, outcome two is obedience. And this was the shock to the system. For both groups, acceptance or justification on the day of judgment is based on actual heart-level obedience.
Wow. I mean, that would have completely shattered the assumptions of his Jewish audience, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It would have been offensive to some.
Because there was this really prevalent idea of exceptionalism at the time. Like, the cultural assumption was that simply possessing the Torah, having the scroll sitting in your synagogue and bearing the physical mark of circumcision acted as a kind of divine shield.
Yeah, get out of jail free card.
Right. It was an assumption of automatic immunity from God's wrath just by being part of the in-group.
And that assumption of immunity was so deeply ingrained. They believed the mere possession of the law was the absolute key to their security.
But Paul says no.
Right, Paul dismantles that whole framework by insisting that just hearing the law is entirely insufficient. Only the doers of the law will be justified.
Because he lists some pretty specific stuff, doesn't he?
He does. He lists specific, tangible, ethical violations to prove his point stealing, committing adultery, robbing temples. He is moving completely past minor ceremonial disputes and launching a direct critique against actual behavioral disobedience.
It's kind of like having a top-tier gym membership.
Okay, I like where this is going.
You carry the heavy metal card in your wallet, you wear the branded apparel, you might even hang out in the lobby and drink an expensive protein smoothie.
But you're not sweating.
Right. Possessing the membership doesn't make you fit. You actually have to lift the weights. Your possession of the law is just a membership card, Heart obedience is the actual workout.
That is a perfect analogy, and this raises an important question. If true justification requires the actual doing of the law, how can anyone, especially these Gentiles who don't even possess the written manual, achieve this required obedience?
Yeah, because just a chapter later, Paul famously declares that everyone, Jew and Gentile, is under sin, like everyone falls short. So how on earth did these Gentiles manage to pull off this obedience?
Well, that brings us to the actual mechanism of obedience and a massive grammatical puzzle in the text regarding a single Greek word.
Right, the word physei.
Yes. The physei debate in Romans 2, specifically verses 14 and 15, is one of those academic puzzles with just massive theological stakes.
So physei translates to by nature or by instinct, right?
Exactly. And the controversy revolves entirely around where you place that word in the Greek sentence structure.
It's crazy that placing a single word in a different part of the sentence changes the entire theological landscape. But let's break down the two options the paper talks about.
Sure. So option 1 places physei next to the verb. In English, it reads, when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires.
Okay, so by nature they just do it.
Right. Reading it this way implies that unbelieving Gentiles have an innate, natural, moral compass. Scholars actually call this the pagan moralist view.
So it's suggesting that, brilliant pagan philosophers like Aristotle or Seneca could just naturally figure out God's moral requirements through their own unassisted human conscience.
That's the idea, yes.
But the source paper highlights a glaring problem with that interpretation. Because in Romans 1, just a few paragraphs earlier, Paul describes the minds of the pagan world as completely darkened and futile. Like, they exchange the truth for a lie.
Exactly. It completely defines logic that he would spend chapter 1 saying their minds are broken and then turn around in chapter 2 and praise their brilliant, unassisted, natural moral compass.
Right, which points us toward option 2.
Right. Option 2 places physei next to the noun, the Gentiles themselves. So it reads, when Gentiles, who by nature do not have the law, do the things required by the law.
Oh, okay.
Under this reading, by nature means by birthright or physical ancestry. They are natural-born Gentiles, physically outside the Mosaic covenant.
But they are somehow doing the law. So who are these people if they aren't pagan philosophers?
The paper argues for the New Covenant Christian view. These are Gentile believers in Jesus Christ.
Okay, so they're Christians.
Yes. Their obedience isn't bubbling up from some natural human instinct. It is the literal, real-time fulfillment of the ancient Old Testament promises found in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36, the promise that God would take the law off external stone tablets and write it directly onto the human heart.
The law written on the heart by the Holy Spirit. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because I have to push back on this for a second.
Go for it.
In a lot of Protestant traditions, there is a massive brick wall built between law and grace. Like, we are taught that justification is a completely free gift through Christ's propitiation, meaning Jesus absorbed the full penalty for sin on the cross, taking the punishment so we don't have to.
Right, and Romans 3 absolutely affirms that.
Okay, but if salvation is a free gift apart from our works, why does this paper argue that faith actually upholds the moral requirements of the law? Doesn't the law just get completely abolished once grace arrives?
That assumption that the law is just abolished is called antinomianism.
Antinomianism.
Yeah, and Paul anticipates that exact deduction and utterly destroys it. In Romans 3.31, he asks, do we then nullify the law through this faith? Absolutely not. On the contrary, we uphold the law.
Wow. Okay.
And the Greek term he uses for uphold is hystanamon, which doesn't just mean to casually support something. It means to make something stand firm, to structurally secure a building so it doesn't collapse.
So if the moral law were just tossed out the window, the entire structural integrity of God's justice would collapse.
Precisely the point. The standard of judgment based on heart obedience would be rendered totally meaningless. The penal demands of sin were absolute and they were met at the cross.
Right.
But grace doesn't lower the divine standard of holiness. Instead, the mechanism of achieving it changes. We transition from stone to spirit. The indwelling Holy Spirit empowers a real, inward moral renewal. So the believer is finally equipped to render the very heart obedience the law always demanded.
That makes so much sense. Faith establishes the law because it finally provides the internal power to live it out. It is not a free pass to ignore morality, it's the power to achieve it.
Exactly.
That completely flips the script. But shifting gears slightly, the paper shows how misunderstanding this exact concept of internal heart obedience led to, well, a catastrophic theological error in the early church.
Yes. It paved the way for replacement theology, which is commonly known as supersessionism.
Wait, supersessionism, that's essentially the idea that the church hit copy-paste over Israel, right? Like the belief that the predominantly Gentile Christian church permanently replaced national ethnic Israel as God's chosen people, and that Israel basically forfeited all its future covenants and land promises?
That is the core of it, yes. And the historical genesis of this idea is really tragic. We have to look at the geopolitical context of the early centuries to understand it.
What was going on then?
Well, after the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 A.D. and later the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman Empire was fiercely cracking down on Jewish rebellions. Early Christian apologists, who were increasingly Gentile, felt this intense cultural and political pressure to distance themselves from their Jewish roots just to survive in the Roman world. So in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr formally introduced the concept, explicitly calling the church the true spiritual Israel.
Wow. And the theological shift just snowballed from there, didn't it? The paper notes how Tertullian disrupted the continuity of the Bible by creating two completely distinct paths to salvation.
Yeah, he completely split it.
And then Augustine comes along and views the preservation of the Jewish people not as a promise of future restoration, but merely as a blind historical testimony. He essentially viewed them as museum pieces meant to prove the validity of Christian prophecy.
It's a very dark shift. And by the 16th century, Martin Luther formalized what scholars call punitive supersessionism.
Punitive, so like as a punishment.
Exactly. He asserted that Israel was permanently rejected and displaced by God as a punishment for their persistent disobedience, a theology that tragically fueled systemic anti-Semitism for centuries.
That is heavy. But how did these brilliant theologians justify this biblically? Because the paper points out that they weaponize Romans 2, specifically verses 28 and 29,
Yes.
where Paul writes, "He is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart by the Spirit."
Right. Supersessionists use that specific text to claim Paul is ontologically redefining the term Jew.
Ontologically redefine it. So they mean he's changing the very essence of the word.
In other words, yes, they argue he is completely changing the dictionary definition of the word. They claim that any baptized Christian, regardless of their physical descent, magically becomes a true Jew and inherits all the promises made to Abraham.
But the paper exposes that as a massive hermeneutical misuse of the text. Like they are twisting Paul's original intent.
Without a doubt.
Paul isn't redefining ethnic identity to mean any Christian. He is actually just echoing Moses in Deuteronomy and Jeremiah in chapter 4. This is a standard internal prophetic critique of hypocrisy.
It's exactly. True Jewishness, Paul is arguing, requires both physical lineage and inward faith. And what's fascinating here is how early church leaders took a standard Jewish critique, a Hebrew prophet calling his own people to genuine faith, and weaponized it to strip ethnic Israel of its covenant promises entirely.
It's just wild. It's like a basketball coach yelling at his team during halftime, criticizing their lack of effort. He's yelling, "You call yourselves players. You're not real players unless you show some heart out there."
Right.
The coach is not redefining the sport of basketball. He's not telling the random fans in the stands to come down, put on the jerseys, and take over the team. He's telling his actual players to play like they belong on the court.
That analogy tracks perfectly. True Jewishness, in Paul's argument, isn't less than ethnic identity, it's more. It is physical lineage joined with spiritual transformation. To say physical descent is completely irrelevant, well, it imports an alien theology into the text that Paul never intended.
Okay, so if the church hasn't replaced Israel, but Gentiles are clearly included in the new covenant, what exactly is the relationship between the two?
That is the big question.
Right, and Paul answers this by moving into Romans chapters 9 through 11, where he introduces this brilliant botanical metaphor.
Yes, but before we get to the horticulture, we really have to clear a stumbling block in Romans 9.6, where Paul states, "Not all Israel descended from Israel."
Oh, right. Supersessionists love to quote this.
They do. They claim it proves the spiritual redefinition we just talked about, allowing the church to essentially steal the title of Israel.
But context matters. The paper points out that most critical interpreters recognize Paul is making an internal distinction within ethnic Israel itself. Like, he's drawing a line between mere physical descendants and the believing remnant within the nation. He is not throwing the doors open to define Israel as a bunch of Gentiles.
Exactly. Which brings us to Romans 11 and the cultivated olive tree. This metaphor is the ultimate refutation of replacement theology.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Picture a first-century orchard. You have this massive, ancient olive tree. The root represents the unconditional patriarchal promises made by God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The trunk represents Israel's rich covenantal history.
Okay, I see it. But then the gardener steps in. From that trunk, some of the natural branches are broken off.
Right.
These represent unbelieving ethnic Israelites who have been temporarily severed because they rejected the Messiah. And in their place, the gardener takes grafted-in wild branches, which are the Gentile believers, and attaches them to the tree.
And you have to understand, in first-century agriculture, grafting a wild branch onto a cultivated tree was shocking. It goes completely against the natural process. But Paul uses this shock value to make a specific point.
What's the point?
The crucial detail is that the wild branches do not replace the tree. They don't become the trunk. They certainly don't support the root. Paul explicitly says they are grafted among the natural branches to share in the rich root system.
Right. If the church had replaced Israel, God would have uprooted the entire tree, burned it, and planted a brand new one.
Yeah, exactly.
But he didn't. He grafted the wild branches into an already existing cultivated tree, and he even warns the Gentile branches against spiritual pride, reminding them that, hey, if God can graft wild branches in, he can easily graft the natural Jewish branches back into their own tree.
And this horticultural lesson drives toward the ultimate endgame, the eschatological climax, found in Romans 11:25 and 26. Paul reveals a mystery. He says, a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved.
Oh man, the definition of all Israel in that verse is basically the heavyweight title fight of New Testament scholarship.
It really is.
The paper outlines 4 primary interpretations. Let's walk through them.
Sure. Let's look at the reasoning behind each. First is the ecclesial model. This claims all Israel just means the entire multi-ethnic church. Scholars often lean into this because they desire total unity, sort of flattening everyone into a single spiritual category.
Okay, what's the second one?
Second is the two-covenant model. This suggests Jews are saved through a separate covenant based on the Torah, without needing Jesus at all.
Really?
Yeah, this model gained traction as a post-Holocaust theological reaction, an attempt to validate Judaism separately, but it fundamentally violates the core premise of the gospel.
Right, because Paul spends the entire letter establishing that there is only one mechanism of salvation for both groups. Faith.
Exactly. Third is the historical remnant model, which argues all Israel refers only to the sum total of individual Jewish believers saved throughout history. This is often held by cautious scholars who don't want to make grand predictions about future end times events.
Makes sense. And the fourth?
Finally, there is the national restoration model, which argues for a massive, miraculous future conversion of ethnic Jews to Jesus at the end of history.
You know, I want to point out a massive logical flaw in that first one, the ecclesial model, where all Israel just means the Gentile inclusive church.
Oh, let's hear it.
If all Israel just meant the church, wouldn't Paul be using that term to validate the exact same Gentile arrogance he was actively trying to dismantle just a few verses earlier? I mean, he was literally just warning them not to be boastful against the natural branches.
That is a great point. If we connect this to the bigger picture, your observation highlights a direct logical contradiction in the ecclesial model. Furthermore, the text provides a rigid chronological sequence.
How so?
First, the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, then subsequently, all Israel is saved. You cannot have a sequence if both groups are identical. The sequence itself demands that ethnic Israel remains central to God's irrevocable calling.
So the symmetrical logic of Romans 2 demanding hard obedience over external pretense, it doesn't erase Israel. It actually prepares the nation for its ultimate spirit-wrought restoration.
Exactly. The logical continuity from Romans 2 all the way to Romans 11 is remarkable. It provides a unified model of biblical history. Jew and Gentile are justified on the exact same basis of faith, united in a single body, empowered by the same Spirit, all while preserving the unique identity and future restoration of God's historic covenant people.
Wow. We have covered some sweeping redemptive history today, from first-century debates about exceptionalism to the geopolitical origins of replacement theology to the end-of-times restoration of a nation. But we have to bring this down to earth.
Always a good idea.
How does this specific requirement for hard obedience change the way you, listening right now, actually live your life today?
Well, the synthesis of this entire framework requires a radical shift in how we view our own goodness. It demands that we move away from outward performance, what the paper calls external pretense, and move toward genuine, spirit-empowered living. The paper brings in Romans 8 regarding walking according to the Spirit and Romans 13, which focuses on the love command.
So the application for believers today is realizing that justification by faith is not a license to ignore morality, but it is also not a heavy, crushing burden of external stone tablets. It is an inward transformation.
Yes.
The Holy Spirit enables you to genuinely live out the moral character of the law in your everyday interactions.
And that moral character is driven by love rather than a checklist.
So what does this all mean? It means taking a hard look in the mirror. Are you relying on external markers of success to feel secure?
It's so easy to do.
It is.
Yeah.
Maybe it's having the right theological vocabulary, perfectly attending your weekly meetings, or just curating an image of being a good person in your community. That is the modern equivalent of possessing the law without doing it.
So true.
Or are you cultivating an actual inward transformation, a transformation that yields genuine love, patience, and secret obedience when absolutely no one else is watching?
That is the dividing line, the external badge versus the internal reality. Paul's symmetrical logic makes it clear that God's tribunal only recognizes the latter.
Let's briefly recap the incredible journey of this deep dive. We started by exploring Paul's symmetrical judgment grid, leveling the playing field for humanity. We unpacked the Phaise puzzle and discovered how grace actually establishes the moral law through the power of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
We learned why early church fathers shifted into the tragedy of supersessionism and how the vibrant, shocking metaphor of a grafted olive tree dismantles that replacement theology. Finally, we saw how true heart obedience is fueled not by a checklist, but by internal transformation.
It is a masterful piece of architectural logic. Paul leaves absolutely no loopholes for human pride, whether Jewish or Gentile.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. We've talked a lot about the New Covenant transitioning the law from external stone tablets to being written internally on the human heart by the Spirit. But think about the world we live in today. We are surrounded by a modern, algorithm-driven digital culture. In a way, those algorithms are trying to act as the new Torah of our age.
Oh, wow. That's a profound way to look at it.
Every feed, every notification, every viral trend is an attempt to write a specific cultural script onto your mind. They are trying to train your nature and instinct to react exactly how the culture dictates.
So true.
So the question is, how can you differentiate between the cultural law being forced upon you through your screens and the Spirit's law being written within you? How do you make sure you aren't just going through the motions of a digital age, but actually living out a transformed reality?
That is a vital question for our time. Identifying which author holds the pen to your heart changes everything.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking below the surface, and we'll catch you on the next one.